My wife suddenly locked her phone and moved into the guest room. I thought she was cheating until her coworker showed up at our door in tears. I noticed my wife Sarah acting differently about 3 months ago. Subtle changes at first that I tried to dismiss as stress from her demanding job at the marketing firm. She'd always been open with her phone, leaving it on the counter while she cooked or tossing it on the couch during our evening TV time. But suddenly she started keeping it with her constantly, face down, and I noticed she'd added a passcode I didn't know. When I casually asked about it one evening, she said her company had implemented new security policies requiring password protection on all devices. It seemed plausible, so I didn't push. But then other changes followed: later work hours, distracted conversations, a new perfume she wore only on office days, and eventually the night she announced she'd be sleeping in the guest room because my snoring had gotten worse and she needed better rest for an important project at work. I'd never been a snorer, but I wanted to be understanding, so I agreed to give her space. Then one Saturday morning, someone knocked on our door, and when I opened it, I found myself face to face with a tearful woman who introduced herself as Jessica, Sarah's coworker, and asked if she could please come in because we needed to talk about what Sarah had been dealing with at work. My name is David Morrison, and I've been married to Sarah for 6 years, together for 8. We'd met in our mid-20s through mutual friends at a hiking group and had bonded over our shared love of the outdoors, good coffee, and terrible ponds. Our relationship had been solid, or so I'd thought, built on communication, trust, and genuine friendship alongside romantic love. We'd weathered the normal challenges of marriage, job changes, family drama, financial stress, but had always worked through things together. The changes in Sarah's behavior had been gradual enough that I'd rationalized each one individually. The phone security seemed reasonable, given her job. The later hours made sense because she'd recently been promoted to senior marketing director and had taken on more responsibility. The guest room sleeping arrangement had hurt my feelings, but I told myself it was temporary and that supporting her need for rest was more important than my ego. But as the weeks passed, the distance between us grew more pronounced. Sarah started leaving for work earlier and coming home later. Our weekend routines of farmers market trips and hiking adventures were replaced with her working from the home office or saying she needed to go into the office for urgent matters. When I'd suggest date nights or even just cooking dinner together, she'd claim exhaustion or deadline pressure. Our physical intimacy, which had always been an important part of our relationship, had essentially stopped after she moved to the guest room. I'd started to suspect the obvious, that Sarah was having an affair. The classic signs were there: secrecy, distance, changed appearance, unexplained absences. I'd torture myself imagining scenarios, trying to decide whether to confront her directly or gather evidence first. I felt paralyzed between not wanting to be the paranoid, controlling husband and not wanting to be the oblivious fool who ignored clear warning signs. My best friend Marcus had noticed something was off when he and his wife came over for dinner about a month into Sarah's behavioral changes. After they left, Marcus had texted me asking if everything was okay between Sarah and me, noting that she'd seemed distracted and had barely engaged in conversation. I'd made excuses, but Marcus's observation had confirmed that the changes were visible to others, not just my imagination. I considered multiple approaches to addressing the situation. Part of me wanted to have a direct conversation with Sarah, to ask point-blank what was going on and whether she was happy in our marriage. But another part feared what she might say, feared that asking the question might precipitate a confession I wasn't ready to hear. So I'd waited and watched and made myself quietly miserable with speculation and worry. The morning Jessica showed up, Sarah had gone to the gym, her new Saturday routine that had replaced our weekend adventures together. I was drinking coffee and trying to work on some freelance graphic design projects when the doorbell rang. I wasn't expecting anyone, so I was surprised to find a woman I didn't recognize standing on our porch, clearly upset, with red eyes and a tissue clutched in her hand. She introduced herself as Jessica Chin, said she worked with Sarah, and asked if we could talk. The way she said it, with such urgency and emotion, made my stomach drop. This was it, I thought. This was the moment the affair became undeniable, when the other person's spouse or partner showed up to confront me. I invited her in, my mind racing through how this conversation might go. We sat in the living room, and Jessica took a shaky breath. "I don't know how much Sarah has told you about what's been happening at work," she started, and I realized with confusion that this didn't sound like the beginning of an affair revelation. Probably nothing, knowing her. She's been trying to handle it alone, but it's gotten so bad that I couldn't stay silent anymore. I needed someone to know what she's been going through. I was completely confused now. "I'm sorry, but I don't understand. What has Sarah been going through?" Jessica looked surprised. She hasn't told you any of it? About our boss? About the harassment? The word harassment hit me like cold water. No, she hasn't said anything. Please, tell me what's going on. Jessica explained that she and Sarah both worked under a division director named Robert Hendricks, who'd been with the company for 15 years and had a reputation for being demanding but effective. About 4 months ago, shortly after Sarah's promotion to senior director, Robert had started paying her inappropriate attention. It began with comments about her appearance that crossed professional boundaries, moved into suggestions that they should get drinks after work to discuss her career development, and had escalated to increasingly aggressive attempts to create situations where they'd be alone together. Sarah had tried to handle it professionally at first, Jessica said, clearly declining the invitations and redirecting conversations to work topics. But Robert had become more persistent and more threatening. He'd started making comments suggesting that Sarah's promotion had been based on her looks rather than her abilities. He'd implied that her continued success at the company might depend on being more friendly to leadership. He'd sent messages to her phone at all hours, which was why she'd become so protective of it and added security. I felt sick listening to this. Why didn't she tell me? Why didn't she report him to HR? Jessica's expression was pained. She tried reporting it. About 6 weeks ago, she went to HR with documentation of inappropriate messages and a detailed account of his behavior. The HR director is friends with Robert, has been for years. They buried the complaint. Told Sarah that Robert's comments were probably just misunderstood, that he had an old-fashioned management style but meant well, and that she should be more understanding of generational differences in workplace communication. That's insane, I said, anger rising in my chest. That's textbook harassment and retaliation. I know, Jessica said, but the company has protected Robert for years. He's brought in major clients and revenue, and they don't want to lose him. Sarah became increasingly stressed and isolated after HR dismissed her complaint. Robert got worse because he realized there would be no consequences. He started making threats about her job security, about sabotaging her projects, about ensuring she'd never advance further in the company. Jessica explained that Sarah had been working later hours because she was trying to avoid times when Robert would be around, coming in early or staying late when he wasn't there. The new perfume was an attempt to feel more confident and professional when she had to interact with him. The guest room sleeping arrangement had started because Sarah was having nightmares and anxiety attacks that were waking her up, and she didn't want to disturb me or have to explain what was causing them. She didn't tell you because she was ashamed, Jessica said softly. She felt like she should be able to handle it, like admitting she couldn't manage her boss's harassment meant she was weak or incompetent. She also didn't want to burden you with something she thought she needed to solve herself. I was overwhelmed with emotions, anger at Robert and the company, frustration with Sarah for not telling me, guilt that I'd suspected her of having an affair instead of supporting her through a crisis. Why are you telling me this now? I asked Jessica. Because yesterday, Robert cornered Sarah in the parking garage after everyone else had left. He made explicit threats about her job and her reputation, and he physically blocked her from leaving until she agreed to have dinner with him. She finally agreed just to get away safely, but she came to my office afterward absolutely shattered. I told her she needed to tell you and that she needed to take legal action, but she's so beaten down by the whole situation that she doesn't think anyone will believe her or help her. Jessica pulled out her phone and showed me screenshots of messages she'd received from Sarah over the past months, documenting incidents with Robert, expressing fear and frustration, and asking for advice. The messages painted a picture of someone under severe psychological distress, trying desperately to maintain professional composure while being systematically harassed and gaslit by her boss in the company. I'm showing you this without Sarah's permission, Jessica said, because I'm worried about her mental health and her safety. Robert's behavior is escalating, and the company isn't going to protect her. She needs support, and she needs to know she doesn't have to handle this alone. I thank Jessica for having the courage to come to our home and tell me what was happening. After she left, I sat in the living room trying to process everything. My wife had been dealing with harassment, threats, and institutional betrayal for months while I'd been suspecting her of infidelity. I felt terrible for not noticing the signs, for not creating enough safety in our relationship that she felt she could confide in me. When Sarah came home from the gym an hour later, she found me still sitting in the living room. She immediately sensed something was wrong. What's going on? You look upset. Jessica was here, I said simply. She told me about Robert, about the harassment, about HR burying your complaint. She told me everything you've been going through. Sarah's face went pale, then red, cycling through emotions. She had no right. That was my information to share when I was ready. I know you feel that way, I said gently, but I'm glad she told me because you weren't going to, and you've been suffering alone when you didn't have to. Sarah sat down on the opposite couch, and for a long moment we just looked at each other across the space that had grown between us. Then she started crying, deep wrenching sobs that shook her whole body. I moved to sit beside her and pulled her into a hug, feeling her collapse against me in a way she hadn't in months. Through her tears, Sarah told me everything. The whole story of Robert's escalating harassment, the humiliation of having HR dismiss her complaint, the fear that reporting further would cost her the career she'd worked so hard to build, the shame of feeling powerless in a situation she thought she should be able to control. She told me about the panic attacks, the nightmares, the constant anxiety of going to work and not knowing what Robert would say or do next. "Why didn't you tell me?" I asked, though Jessica had already explained. I needed to hear it from Sarah. "Because I felt so stupid," she said. "I have an MBA. I'm in a senior leadership position, and I couldn't handle my boss making inappropriate comments. I thought you'd think I was overreacting, or that I'd somehow encouraged it. And then when HR didn't take it seriously, I started doubting myself, wondering if I was misinterpreting normal workplace interactions." "None of this is your fault," I said firmly. "Robert is harassing you, the company is enabling him, and you have every right to be upset and scared. But you also have a husband who loves you and wants to support you through this. You don't have to protect me from hard things or handle everything alone." We spent the rest of the day talking, really talking for the first time in months. Sarah explained each behavioral change that I'd noticed. The phone security was because Robert had been sending inappropriate messages, and she didn't want me to accidentally see them and worry. The later hours were about avoiding him. The guest room was about not disturbing me with her nightmares and anxiety. Everything I'd interpreted as signs of an affair had actually been signs of trauma and stress from workplace harassment. I apologized for not being more attuned to what she was going through, for not creating enough space for her to feel safe confiding in me. Sarah apologized for shutting me out and trying to handle everything alone. We acknowledged that we'd both made mistakes in how we dealt with the situation, but we also recommitted to facing it together going forward. The first step was documenting everything. Sarah compiled all the inappropriate messages from Robert, written accounts of verbal incidents with dates and times, the email trail of her HR complaint, and the dismissive response, and statements from Jessica and 2 other colleagues who'd witnessed some of Robert's behavior. The documentation was extensive and damning. Next, we consulted with an employment attorney who specialized in harassment and retaliation cases. The attorney, a sharp woman named Patricia Williams, reviewed the documentation and told Sarah she had a strong case not just against Robert, but against the company for failing to address the harassment and for what appeared to be retaliation after she'd reported it. Patricia explained Sarah's options. She could file a complaint with the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. She could pursue internal remedies by escalating above the HR director who'd bury her complaint, or she could do both simultaneously. Sarah was hesitant about legal action, worried about the professional and financial costs. Patricia was frank with her. Pursuing this would likely mean Sarah couldn't continue working at the company, at least not in her current role. The relationship was too damaged, and retaliation, while illegal, was difficult to prevent in practice. However, the documentation was strong enough that Patricia believed they could negotiate a significant settlement that would provide financial runway while Sarah found a new position. We discussed it extensively over the following week. Sarah was torn between wanting to fight and wanting to just move on and put the whole experience behind her. I supported whatever decision she made, but encouraged her to at least pursue the EOC complaint, both for her own vindication and to create a record that might protect other women at the company from Robert's behavior. Sarah ultimately decided to move forward with both the EOC complaint and the demand letter to the company outlining the harassment, the inadequate response, and the legal violations. Patricia sent the letter to the company's general counsel and CEO, bypassing the HR director who'd buried the original complaint. The response was swift and panicked. Within 3 days, the company's legal team reached out requesting a meeting. They were clearly worried about both the legal liability and the potential reputational damage if the case became public. The company had recently gone through a major marketing campaign about their inclusive and supportive workplace culture, and a harassment lawsuit would severely undermine that message. The negotiations were tense. The company initially tried to minimize the situation, suggesting Sarah had misunderstood Robert's intentions and that any communication breakdown was the result of different management styles. Patricia shut this down immediately by presenting the documented evidence of explicit harassment and the company's failure to respond appropriately. Eventually, the company made an offer, a settlement that included 6 months of Sarah's salary, continuation of health benefits for a year, a neutral reference, and an agreement that Robert would be placed on administrative leave pending an investigation. In exchange, Sarah would resign from her position and sign a non-disclosure agreement about the settlement. The NDA was a sticking point. Sarah didn't want to be silenced about what had happened to her. But Patricia explained that the settlement amount was substantial and would give Sarah financial security while she found a new job, whereas a protracted legal battle could take years and cost enormous amounts in legal fees with no guarantee of a better outcome. After much discussion, Sarah agreed to the settlement with one modification. The NDA would prevent her from discussing the specific settlement terms, but would not prevent her from discussing her experiences with workplace harassment in general terms or from participating in any legal or regulatory proceedings. The company agreed to this language, clearly just wanting to close the situation quickly. Throughout this process, I saw Sarah gradually reclaim herself. The weight of carrying the secret and the stress of dealing with Robert's harassment had been crushing her, and now that it was out in the open and being addressed, she started to seem lighter. She moved back into our bedroom, started engaging with our friends again, and began talking about her career future with excitement rather than dread. The settlement was finalized about 6 weeks after Jessica's visit to our house. Sarah's last day at the company was emotional, not because she was sad to leave, but because she was saying goodbye to colleagues like Jessica who'd supported her. Several coworkers told her privately that they were glad she'd stood up to Robert, and 2 women shared that they'd also experienced inappropriate behavior from him but hadn't felt they could report it. This revelation reinforced for Sarah that pursuing the complaint had been the right choice. Even though the NDA prevented her from being completely public about her experience, the investigation the company had been forced to open had created space for other complaints to surface. We later heard through Jessica that Robert had been quietly terminated shortly after Sarah's departure, with the company citing conduct inconsistent with company values without providing details. Sarah took a month off before starting her job search, using the time to decompress and reconnect with parts of herself that had been subsumed by the stress of the harassment situation. We went on a hiking trip, spent long weekends at the coast, and generally remembered what our relationship looked like when it wasn't overshadowed by crisis and secrets. When Sarah did start looking for new positions, she was thoughtful about company culture and leadership. She researched companies thoroughly, asked detailed questions in interviews about how they handled workplace conflicts, and ultimately accepted a position at a smaller firm with strong female leadership and a demonstrated commitment to employee well-being. The new role was actually a step up from her previous position, with better pay and more strategic responsibility. About 6 months after Jessica's visit, we had Jessica and her husband over for dinner to thank her for having the courage to tell me what was happening. Jessica said she'd been terrified that morning, worried she was overstepping, and that Sarah would never forgive her for breaking her confidence. But she'd also seen how much Sarah was struggling and felt that silence would be more harmful than speaking up. Sarah told Jessica that while she'd been angry initially, she now recognized that Jessica's intervention had been an act of real friendship. She said she'd been in a dark place, convinced she had to handle everything alone and that asking for help was weakness. Having someone force the issue and bring David into the situation had ultimately saved her from continuing down a destructive path. Looking back now, a year after those difficult months, I can see how close Sarah and I came to real damage to our relationship. My suspicions about an affair, while understandable given the behavioral changes, had created distance and mistrust that would have been hard to repair. Sarah's isolation and secrecy, while rooted in shame and fear rather than betrayal, had eroded our usual communication and intimacy. What saved us was Jessica's willingness to intervene and Sarah's eventual openness about what she'd been experiencing. Once the truth was out, we could address the real problem together rather than each dealing privately with misconceptions and fears. The situation also taught us important lessons about communication, about creating safety in our relationship for difficult conversations, and about the importance of asking for help rather than trying to manage everything alone. Sarah's experience with workplace harassment is unfortunately not unique, and the company's initial response of protecting the harasser rather than the victim is all too common. But Sarah's decision to pursue accountability, supported by documentation and legal representation, did make a difference, both for her own healing and potentially for other women at that company. The settlement provided financial security during a transition period, and the legal process validated that what she'd experienced was real and wrong, countering the gaslighting she'd received from HR. My wife suddenly locked her phone and started sleeping in the guest room, and my worst fears were that she was having an affair. The reality was so different and so much worse. She was being systematically harassed at work and was too ashamed and overwhelmed to tell me. When her coworker showed up at our door to reveal the truth, it was a crisis point that could have destroyed us, but instead became a turning point toward healing and reconnection. The experience fundamentally changed how Sarah and I approach our marriage. We're more intentional about checking in with each other, about creating space for difficult conversations, about asking directly about stress and struggles rather than assuming we know what's going on. We've also become more aware of how workplace harassment and other forms of psychological stress can manifest and change behaviors that might be misinterpreted by partners. Sarah has become an advocate for workplace harassment victims, mentoring younger women in her field and sharing her story in appropriate context to help others recognize that they're not alone and that seeking support is strength, not weakness. The NDA prevents her from discussing specific details of her settlement, but she can and does talk about the general experience of being harassed, the impact it had on her mental health and relationships, and the importance of documentation and legal advocacy. For my part, I've learned to pay attention not just to what changes in Sarah's behavior, but to ask better questions and create more safety for honest answers. I've learned that supporting your partner sometimes means pushing past their resistance to being helped, that isolation often makes hard situations worse, and that the most loving thing you can do is refuse to let someone you love suffer alone. The months when Sarah was dealing with Robert's harassment, while I was suspecting her of an affair, were some of the darkest of our marriage. But getting through it together, once the truth was revealed, has ultimately made us stronger and more resilient. We know now that we can weather serious crises, that we can repair trust after it's been damaged, and that honest communication, even when it's difficult and painful, is essential to maintaining a healthy relationship. My wife locked her phone and moved to the guest room, and when her coworker showed up to explain why, everything changed. The truth was harder than I'd imagined, but also more manageable, because we finally faced it together. Sometimes the thing you fear most, the confrontation you're avoiding, the difficult conversation you keep postponing, is exactly what's needed to break through to healing and understanding. And sometimes the person who forces that confrontation, like Jessica did, is performing an act of tremendous courage and friendship that deserves gratitude rather than resentment.